I'm Cliff Ribner, and I want to talk to you today about law. There's actually two types of law. We talk about how we want to live under the rule of law, and we do. If there's no rule of law, then what we have is the law of the jungle. That's what anarchy is, when there's no law at all and might makes right. There's always some kind of law going on, even if it's not law. But if there's no actual law, no one is in charge, that's when the law of the jungle is there. And that can happen in a variety of ways, including in ways when it looks like there's tons of law. When there's too much law, then the law becomes unenforceable. And whoever is in charge of enforcing it gets to pick and choose which laws to enforce and which ones not to enforce, so that they don't enforce it against their buddies, but they do enforce it against those they want to punish, those they want to go after. And that's the real law of the jungle. So you can have too much law. That's one problem that laws can create. But also, there's actually two types of law. There's good law and there's bad law. There was no shortage of laws in Nazi Germany. Everything they did was legal. They just passed laws saying Jews have to go to the gas chamber, or whatever they wanted to pass the laws to say. Actually, what the laws said is that Hitler was in charge of everything. He could do whatever he wanted. That was their law. And all businesses in the country were completely under the thumb of the Nazi Party. And that is the same thing in some ways that we have here in the United States. All of those federal regulatory agencies, every one of them have under their jurisdiction entire segments of the market. Entire businesses are completely under their thumb. And those regulatory agencies are essentially lawless. They have the power to bully everyone under their thumb because there's no real check on them, because they don't really answer to anyone. And it's a terrible situation. This is what has been created. It's what they had in the Soviet Union. The same thing. Again, they had too much law there. All those agencies, what it is, let me tell you what the two types of law are, and then you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. Good law is one type, and bad law is the other. Good law is when the laws tell you what you can and you can't do, and you're free to either follow them or not. It's up to you and your conscience and your desire to follow the law. And in a society where people respect the law, they follow the laws. And if they break the law, there's two types of law that can come after them. If they are criminals, if they rob someone or they rape someone, then they get prosecuted, and there has to be due process. But it happens in a court. That's where the law is enforced. It's enforced in a court under due process after the fact, after the misbehavior has occurred. That's the criminal context of good law. The civil context is what we call the law of contracts, the law of property, the law of torts, and all of that is governed by civil procedures, which govern the way it's enforced. But again, when it's good law, citizens don't have to ask for permission to do whatever they want to do. They know what they're allowed to do, and they know what they're not allowed to do. And if they break the law, then after the fact, if they harm someone, that's what it is. If they actually harm someone, then that person who they harm can bring a lawsuit against them. If they violate someone else's property, that can be a violation of property laws and of what's called the law of torts. That's the law of civil wrongs. And there's all sorts of tort law. The tort law and the criminal law is based on what's called the common law. It only exists in the English-speaking world because it was developed by the English courts. They don't have this in continental Europe. They've never had it. It is the good law of free men, because we have to have laws to protect us and our property from infringements by other people and also infringements by the government. If the government tries to infringe on your property, you have the right to take them to court. The fact that they're the government doesn't prevent you from suing them. And that's the way it is in a society governed by good law. The laws apply after the fact, after due process, and you're allowed to act as you want in the first instance. And if you do harm to someone else, then you have to compensate them. They can sue you and you have to pay them. And if you commit a crime, then you get prosecuted and you go to jail. That's the way it is in a law-abiding, good law country. Now, bad law is very different. It's what all those alphabet agencies do. What bad law is, first of all, it doesn't get written by courts. It gets written by the people who are enforcing the law themselves, the bureaucrats. They write their own laws. They are empowered to do that in the legislation that creates those agencies. That's what those agencies do. And what they do is they create what would be called a prior restraint. In good law, if someone is going to do something that you want to prevent them from doing, you can bring a lawsuit asking a court to order them not to do that. So that, for example, if someone is harassing you, you can bring a lawsuit against them for stalking and get a court to order them not to stalk you. That's called a prior restraint against that person. That's what that injunction that the court will issue, the order telling that person not to harm you, is. Now, the way bad law operates, it's all like there's injunctions where you're forbidden to do all sorts of things unless you get permission from one of those regulatory agencies. So it's constant prior restraints. And let me give you an example of how bad this is. We have an entire body of law involving the First Amendment, which prevents the government from putting a prior restraint on what you can say and where you can say it. Because you have, under the First Amendment, the right to speech. And you can exercise it anywhere where you're not harming anyone. It's really that simple. Congress shall make no law infringing that right or your freedom of religion. And it's absolutely forbidden for Congress or any court or any state agency to issue any law violating that. But they do it all the time. I'm going to give you an example of that. The SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, which was created in 1933 under completely fraudulent. It was part of FDR's New Deal. They pretended that the Great Depression, which had begun in 1929, was caused by stock manipulators, inflating the value of stock. That was the pretext for the creation of the SEC, to basically police the purchase and sales of securities. That's what their job is. It's completely unconstitutional. There's nothing in the Constitution that permits the federal government to get involved with that at all. If people commit fraud in connection with selling securities, every state has all sorts of laws involving that. They have criminal laws, and there are state tort laws. If someone defrauds you, you can sue them for committing the fraud of tort, or the tort of fraud against you. You don't need the SEC for that. The SEC was created under completely false pretenses, and Milton Friedman, the great economist, proved it. He wrote a whole book showing that no, the Great Depression was not caused by stock manipulation and people cheating each other in the stock market. Not at all. In fact, it was caused by the Federal Reserve Bank tightening credit. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913. Before the Federal Reserve, all money in this country, it wasn't paper money issued by the federal government. We had paper money, but it was issued by private banks. That's the way with very few exceptions. There were a few times when the government did get involved. Wasn't supposed to, but it did. Because the Constitution doesn't give the federal government the power to print any paper money at all. It's very specific about this. In Article 1, Section 8, it gives the federal government the power to coin money, not to print it. They didn't want the federal government to be in the business of printing money. And they knew all about this because earlier in the 18th century, the French had created what's called the Bank of France, and they issued all this paper money. And without getting into all the details of it, it went kaboom. And they had seen paper money crash because it wasn't backed by gold. In that case, it was backed by the land that the French owned half of what is now America. They owned what's called the Louisiana Territory, which Thomas Jefferson purchased from them as president. But they owned it prior to that, and they used that as the backing for their paper money. So the paper money, at least in theory, had some backing. It wasn't like it was just pieces of paper. What we have now, what the Fed does, it's not backed by anything. Prior to Nixon, it was at least backed by a hint of being backed by gold. But that hasn't been true. And the currency has inflated massively since Nixon took us off the last vestige of the gold standard. But the truth is, there was never supposed to be a Fed involved with our money. Banks were supposed to issue it. It was all done without the government's involvement at all. And you could literally go to a bank. It would say the name of the bank on it. And if it was they had $1 million bills. You could take $1 million bill to a bank, and if it was issued from that bank, they had to give you $1 million worth of gold. And that's the way it worked, and the currency never had any inflation whatsoever. Anyway, bad law is what permits something like the Fed to exist, where they monopolize the currency. So the whole creation of all of those agencies was done contrary to the Constitution, which is very clear. It doesn't talk about good law and bad law, but it talks about the laws that it authorizes, and it does not anywhere permit the Fed to exist. So its very existence is bad law. The fact that an agency is in charge of printing all of our money, monopolize the currency, that's an example of bad law. And all of those, that's just one example. The SEC is another example. Everything the SEC does consists of prior restraints on citizens involved in any aspect of buying or selling stock or bonds, any security, anything they're allowed to put their hands on and stick their nose into. And it's supposed to be to benefit stock investors, but it doesn't. Never once have they caught an actual fraud. In fact, the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme was brought to them years before Bernie Madoff was charged with anything. They didn't do a thing about it. And that's how worthless they are. But the whole creation of the SEC was based on the fraud that stock manipulation had caused the depression. So they created the SEC. And the SEC orders everyone involved in buying and selling stocks what they can say. You can't sell stock except under their rules. They create all sorts of rules. These things are supposed to protect people. They don't protect anybody. What they do is they protect lawyers' jobs. That's really the only thing they protect. And there's an entire bureaucracy built up around this. But you can have situations where the SEC orders executives not to speak about their own company. They've done this to Elon Musk. That's what they do. They control the speech. They dictate what everyone involved who's an executive or a director of any company in this country can say about their own company. It's all absolute violations of the First Amendment. And the FDA is the same thing. They control what drug companies can say about their drugs. They control what drug companies are allowed to buy and sell. If you're dying from some disease and there's a drug out there that you've heard about and you want to buy it, you can't buy it unless the unless the FDA lets you. And you end up having to pay, if they even permit the drug to be sold, the prices that they go for are insane because the company has to spend practically half the life of the patent proving on a statistical basis, not in reality, purely statistically, that the drug is efficacious. And that's after proving it's safe. Proving it's safe is the easy part. Proving it's also effective within their meaning of effectiveness takes years. And during that time, the patent is running, and they're paying to get this all done. That's why they spend billions of dollars before they can even bring the drug to market. And they have to get that back or they go out of business. And that's why drug prices are so high. And it doesn't save a single life. The SEC has never saved anybody a single dollar from fraud. And that's what all those federal agencies do. They are all examples of bad law, none of which should exist. And Congress created those agencies with bad law, and it made it even worse by empowering them to write their own laws. They call them regulations, because under the Constitution, a law has to meet very specific requirements. It has to meet the procedural requirements to become a law specified in Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution. None of those regulations meet that. None of them are even close to being qualified as laws under the Constitution. But if you violate them, they'll treat it as if you broke the law. It can be a crime. That's how bad the situation is with bad law in America. And I'm just giving you those very few examples. But bad law is whatever every one of those agencies does. It's all bad law. The only good law that the federal government is involved with is the Constitution itself and protecting us from federal employees. That's good law that the federal government is involved in. The other good law is what the states administer, and only the states are supposed to be administering it, which is the common law, the law of property, of torts, the criminal law, the laws that exist to police us, to protect us from harming each other. That's the real rule of law. And all of that is under the Constitution, which is another part of the good law. The bad law is every type of law that isn't good law. And the only good law is the common law and the Constitution. And the great thing about the Constitution, our Constitution creates a federal government. That's where it's created. It's created in the Constitution. So it's completely bound by the Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It's the first time a country created its own, or the citizens of a country created their own central government, which is designed solely to serve the citizens and whose powers are specified in that document. It doesn't have any power that isn't given to it in that document. And that's very important, because between the citizen and the state, power is always a zero-sum game. Every drop of power the federal government has is taken at our expense. And that's why it's very important that it only have the powers that we want it to have. And that's what's in the Constitution. So the Constitution and the common law as administered by the states, that's what good law is. Everything else is bad law. And all the laws that created and are created by each of those federal alphabet agencies are all examples of terrible bad law. And none of that's Constitution. And our Constitution contemplated that the government would try to do that, and it forbade it, because it doesn't have the power to do anything that any of those agencies do. And the courts have been pretending that one clause and one clause alone permits every one of those agencies to exist and to have those powers, and that clause doesn't mean what they've been pretending it says. It's the Interstate Commerce Clause. They've been pretending that because it uses the word commerce, that clause gives the federal government the power to police anything which is commercial. It's a Marxist reading of the Constitution. That's not what the Interstate Commerce Clause is about. And in the Federalist 42, James Madison described exactly what it's for. The purpose of that clause is to prevent the states, not the citizens, but the states, from harming out-of-state businesses. That's its purpose. And that's its only purpose, and that's the only reason it was ever supposed to be there. And that was reaffirmed in the one one of two opinions on the subject of the Interstate Commerce Clause during the 19th century by James Marshall. It's a case called Gibbons v. Ogden. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, please like this video and send it to other people. Thank you.